quite excited about this video because we're going to be talking about a fascinating writer who created one of the most famous novels in the English language, Frankenstein. But she's historically been thought of in terms of her relationships with other people rather than her achievements in her own right. Mary Shelley. Of course, she was the lover and then the wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Romantic poet. She was the daughter of the eminent early feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which I've posted in the notes, by the way. It's a seminal text of feminism. She was also the daughter of the Enlightenment philosopher William Godwin. But she did an awful lot more in her career than just Frankenstein and just being married to Shelley, as we're about to find out. Now, in order to understand how remarkable she was, we need to understand something about the literary cult that her social circle was part of, and that is Romanticism. Obviously, she was married to Shelley. She was also hanging out with other romantic figures, such as Byron, for example. And yet, she managed to voice some concerns about their philosophies and to actually challenge these very intellectual men. So let's find out a little bit about Romanticism. Romanticism, or the Romantic era, was at its peak from around 1800 to 1850. So if you think of Jane Austen having reacted to sensibility by going the other direction and talking about literary realism and her novels being set in drawing rooms and at balls and all that kind of thing, Mary Shelley's pretty much the opposite, and the Romantics generally are pretty much the opposite. Romanticism does have the same attachment to emotion that sensibility had, but it also focuses on things like nature and very much focuses on the individual and is a proponent of individualism. And that was something that Mary Shelley actually had some issues with. The glorification of the past is another part of Romanticism, and it tends to prefer the medieval to the classical. And of course, well-to-do men of that period were given a classical education. They would have learned Latin and Greek. They would have been well versed with classical mythology. So Romanticism was based on the German Durmstrang movement, and another big component of it was the French Revolution and political radicalism. It preferred emotion to intuition or to the rationality of the Enlightenment, and so it's seen as the opposite of realism. Most romantics were progressive in their views, although it's also associated with nationalism, and that's a bit confusing to us in our day, where we tend to associate nationalism with conservatism, not so for the Romantics. The movement was led in France by writers such as Balzac and Flaubert, and they were the foremost romantic writers in France. In America, well-known romantics include Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe. In England, the sentimental novel belonged within the Romantic movement, but the first sort of true work of Romanticism is seen to be Lyrical Ballads, which is a collection of poems by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They were what's known as first-generation Romantics. They were dedicated to the cause of individual freedom, but when they went to France and actually witnessed the horrors of the revolution and its brutality and violence, they somewhat apostatized, whereas the second generation didn't see the revolution up close and so were more committed to its ideals. And these include Shelley, Lord Byron and Keats. Mary Shelley is also considered a second generation romantic, and she certainly spent a lot of time with them, but she had some differences in thinking with them, and also they were mostly poets, whereas she was a novelist, so she didn't embrace the same genre as those in her circle. Let's hear a little bit about her life, because actually a lot of her works are viewed as being at least quasi-autobiographical, and so understanding her life and her circle will really inform our reading of her works. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, née Godwin, lived between 1796 and 1851. Her mother was the eminent early feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, as we've heard before, and her father, of course, William Godwin. She's known for Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, to give it its full title. And this is actually considered a prototype science fiction novel. I'm sure you can think of a lot of movies and TV shows and cartoons and various elements of popular culture that cite Frankenstein. Probably when I say the word Frankenstein, the picture of, say, a green monster with like a screw in its head comes to mind. Of course, Frankenstein was the creator and not the monster, we must remember. Another thing that Mary Shelley did was that she edited her husband Percy Bysshe Shelley's works. And for a long time, she was thought of for both those things, for Frankenstein and editing Percy Shelley. But recent scholarship sees her achievements as far more wide-reaching. As well as Frankenstein, her novels include Valperga, published in 1823, Perkin Warbeck, published in 1830, The Last Man, published in 1826, Lodore, published in 1835, and Faulkner, published in 1837. She also wrote the travel book Rambles in Germany and Italy, and biographical articles for Cabinet Cyclopedia between 1829 and 1846, which are taken by some to indicate that she remained a political radical throughout her life, because there are others who view her as having become more conservative as she got older. Shelley challenged the individualism promoted in her husband's works and her father's Enlightenment philosophy, believing that cooperation and sympathy were needed to reform society. So, in other words, she was much more moderate than her father or her husband had been. Now, sadly, Mary Wollstonecraft died only 11 days after her daughter was born, and so she never really knew her mother, but her mother was still this gargantuan figure in her life and very much an intellectual influence. A year after Mary Wollstonecraft died, Godwin published a tribute to her entitled Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication of the Rights of Women. Now, he had meant this to be something that lauded his wife, but unfortunately it revealed that she'd had affairs and that she had an illegitimate child, and it caused a scandal. Mary was raised by her anarchist father, who gave her an in-depth, though quite informal education. So whereas other women of her day might have been learning to play piano and to embroider, what Jane Austen would have referred to as accomplishments, Mary was really absorbing ideas and philosophies from quite a young age. When she was 4, her father married their neighbour, Mary Jane Clairmont, and I think it's fair to say that Mary did not get on with her stepmother for most of her life. Her stepmother was quite a domineering individual. In June 1812, Mary's father sent her to live with the radical clergyman William Baxter in Scotland, writing to him, "I am anxious that she should be brought up like a philosopher, even like a cynic." So around this time, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley became a sort of political disciple of William Godwin's. Shelley had been deeply influenced by Godwin's Political Justice, which was published in 1793. And so he starts visiting the house, and Mary has come back home by then, and he starts to notice her. Now, Shelley's new radical views had set him at odds with his aristocratic family, and so they pulled the plug on the money, basically. Shelley had agreed to bail William Godwin out of his debts and then had to renege on that when he couldn't get his hands on the money, and Godwin took it very badly and saw it as a betrayal, and so he deeply disapproved of Shelley and Mary's relationship. In her own words, she said that she had an excessive and romantic attachment to my father. He, of course, was the one that taught her that marriage was repressive monopoly, and she felt that her relationship actually embodied his ideals and couldn't understand why he objected to it so strenuously. They then met in secret at Mary Wollstonecraft's grave, and there is a story that goes round that Mary actually lost her virginity at her mother's grave with Shelley. Don't know if that's true or not, but I think because it's a really gothic idea and she wrote some really gothic novels, that's probably where that comes from. So in the end, Godwin not coming round, Shelley left the country with Mary and with Mary's stepsister Claire Clairmont, and they headed for France before travelling through Europe for a year. Unlike the other second-generation romantics who revered the ideals of the French Revolution, Mary was actually quite disturbed by some of the things that she saw in France and wrote, "The distress of the inhabitants, whose houses had been burned, their cattle killed, and all their wealth destroyed, has given a sting to my detestation of war." As they travelled, Shelley and Mary kept a joint journal, but they also wrote their own individual pieces, and they read from the works of Mary Wollstonecraft as they went along. And then the inevitable happened, and they ran out of money. Also, Mary was pregnant, so they had to return to England. Now, Percy Shelley was married, and so the couple faced ostracism and poverty in England. They were socially disowned, and also they had the tragedy of the loss of their premature daughter. Godwin had completely turned his back on them, and we could see this as the reaction of a repressive conservative society, but I would postulate, think of it from Harriet's point of view, Shelley's wife. She had been abandoned with a child. Her husband had cleared off with not one but two other women, and her lot must have actually been pretty miserable. So sympathy, I think, pretty much went with her. Mary and Shelley then started living in London, and the literati often visited their house. They became a centre for literature. But Percy disappeared for long periods of time in order to avoid his creditors, and that was very hard for Mary. Mary was made really jealous when Percy was joyful over the birth of his child with Harriet, and his frequent outings with Claire Clairmont also was something that caused her concern. Now, they were both meant to believe in free love, and it wasn't meant to be an exclusive relationship. Percy actually encouraged Mary to start a sexual relationship with his friend, the writer and barrister Thomas Jefferson Hogg, and Mary did actually consider this but decided against it. When Mary's premature daughter died, she wrote to Hogg, "My dearest Hogg, my baby is dead. Will you come to see me as soon as you can? I wish to see you. It was perfectly well when I went to bed. I awoke in the night to give it suck. It appeared to be sleeping so quietly that I would not wake it. It was dead then, but we did not find that out until morning. From its appearance, it evidently died of convulsions. Will you come? You are so calm a creature, and Shelley is afraid of a fever from the milk, for I am no longer a mother now." I am no longer a mother now. I mean, she's just so lonely. You can really hear it in these words. She's with Shelley, but not completely with Shelley. He's often not there. And she's writing for comfort to this man who she has a sort of ambiguous relationship with. It just sounds like such a lonely situation to me. That year, Mary and Percy, along with Claire Clairmont and Lord Byron and John William Polidori, who is often credited with having instigated the vampire literature genre, spent a summer near Geneva. By this time, Claire was pregnant by Lord Byron, who had been described by a former lover as mad, bad, dangerous to know, so he was really not going to be, perhaps, really a great use in that situation. And also at this time, Mary starts referring to herself as Mrs. Shelley. And while they were there, they were reading German ghost stories, and Lord Byron suggested that they all come up with a ghost story of their own. Now, Mary was actually quite slow to come up with a ghost story, and then this idea percolated in her head of a scientist who tries to create life and pays the consequences. And that was the origins of the Frankenstein story. In the introduction to Frankenstein, she wrote, "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effort of any human endeavour to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world." She had originally conceived this as being a short story, but Percy Shelley encouraged her to expand it into a novel, and it was eventually published in 1818. And she wrote, "I certainly did not owe the suggestion of one incident, nor scarcely of one train of feeling to my husband, and yet but for his incitement, it would never have taken the form in which it was presented to the world." So he didn't influence the story, but he did influence the fact it was a novel and encourage her to publish it. Now, Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote a preface to Frankenstein, and some believed when it was published that he had been the author because Mary Shelley was not named on the cover of the first edition. There's actually some debate into how extensively he edited Frankenstein. Very sadly, in 1816, Harriet drowned herself in the Serpentine at Hyde Park, and the suicide was covered up. Although Harriet's family moved to prevent Percy from getting custody of their children. Also that year, Mary received a worrying letter from her half-sister Fanny Imlay, who was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, the illegitimate daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, and tried to rush to her side, but unfortunately she had committed suicide by the time that Mary got there. So that was a very difficult year. Mary and Percy moved to Bath that year with Claire, hoping to hide Claire's pregnancy. Around this time, Percy's lawyers advised him to marry to help his custody case. And so Percy and the now pregnant Mary married in London on the 30th of December 1816. So she was officially Mrs. Shelley now. As Mary was under 21, her father's consent was needed, so he attended the ceremony as a witness and the rift between them was mended. Claire gave birth to her daughter Allegra on the 13th of January. In March, a court declared Percy Shelley morally unfit to care for his children by Harriet, and they were placed in the care of a clergyman. So his relationship with Mary and with other women had harmed his reputation, and he wasn't seen as a fit parent. Mary gave birth to her third child, Clara, on the 13th of September 1817, and she finished Frankenstein that summer. Percy wrote the preface. As we heard before, he dedicated it to William Godwin. The couple, now living in Marlow in Buckinghamshire, were often separated by Percy's absences when he went to hide from his creditors, and they also lived with the threat of their children being removed, and so they decided they needed to leave England. And in 1818, the Shelleys left Britain permanently to live in Italy, where sadly their second and third children died, and the loss of these children was devastating to Mary. She never got over it, and she fell into a deep depression. Percy wrote in a notebook at the time, "My dearest Mary, wherefore hast thou gone, and left me in this dreary world alone? Thy form is here indeed, a lovely one, but thou art fled, gone down a dreary road that leads to sorrow's most obscure abode. For thine own sake I cannot follow thee, do thou return for mine." Mary Shelley gave birth to their only surviving child, Percy Florence Shelley, who became the third Baronet Shelley. They moved from place to place in Italy, and eventually Mary found herself in an isolated villa in San Terenzio near the Bay of Lerici. There she sadly had a miscarriage, and Percy Shelley was credited with saving her life by doctors when he put her in a bath of ice to stem the flow of blood, which was very severe. Percy was losing connection with his depressed wife, and he spent more time with the married Jane Williams, who was staying in the villa with her husband Edward. And the poetry that he wrote at that time more included Jane than it did Mary. In 1822, Percy Bysshe Shelley went sailing with Edward and with a boat boy in Viareggio in Tuscany, and what happened next was legendary. His boat sank in a storm, and Shelley and the others were drowned. Now, it wasn't unusual for Shelley to disappear for periods of time, but when a letter from his friend Hunt arrived on the 8th of July, Mary realised something was very wrong. Reading the words, "Pray write to tell us how you got home, for they say you had bad weather after you sailed Monday, and we are anxious." So Mary realised what must have happened, and she wrote to a friend, "The paper fell from me, I trembled all over." So she and Jane rushed to Lerici to look for the men, but couldn't find them. And on the 11th of July, the three bodies washed up on the shore between Livorno and Lerici. Byron Hunt and their friend Trelawney cremated Percy Shelley's body on the beach at Viareggio, and Mary is said to have kept his heart, which she put in her desk until her death. Mary then went to Genoa for a year and transcribed Byron's poems, but her financial situation was becoming dire. So she moved back to England to raise her son and to earn a living from writing. In 1824, she moved to Kentish Town to be close to Jane Williams, on whom her biographer Muriel Sparks believed she may have had a crush. She was pretty ill for the last decade of her life, eventually dying of a brain tumour in 1851 at the age of 53. Now let's discuss her literary works. Her works are often considered autobiographical. For example, in Matilda, which was published in 1820, the three central characters are often read as representing Mary Shelley herself, Percy Shelley, and William Godwin. Mary Shelley herself said that the characters in The Last Man are based on her Italian circle. Lord Raymond, one of the characters, left England to fight for the Greeks, as Lord Byron had done, and Adrian, who dies when his boat sinks in a storm, is based on Percy Shelley. On reviewing Godwin's Cloudsley in 1830, she noted that she rejected the idea that authors were merely copying from our own hearts, that writing is not purely based on your own experiences. There's always some imagination, something else that's part of it. Shelley wrote different types of novels. She wrote Gothic novels, Godwinian novels, which are consciously political and focus on power struggles. They're based on Rousseau's confessional style, not confession as in confessing your sins, but as in telling your own side of things, coming from your own experience. She also wrote new historical novels in the vein of Walter Scott, but whereas Scott wrote very masculinized novels, Mary Shelley focused on a female point of view. Frankenstein uses many of the same devices as Godwin's Caleb Williams, which was published in 1794, although Shelley critiqued her father's Enlightenment ideals, achieving the goals of knowledge, freedom, and happiness through rationalism. Valperga is arguably Mary Shelley's answer to William Scott's male-focused historical novel genre. Shelley introduced female characters who were not actually part of the historical records of the wars of the Guelphs and Ghibellines, in order to question political and religious structures. So she's not about portraying a historically accurate record. She's trying to make a point in her historical novels. Mary Shelley tells the story of Perkin Warbeck in a novel of that name, and he was a pretender to the throne of Henry VII. He claimed to be one of the lost princes in the Tower. The character of Lady Gordon represents reason and sensibility in opposition to the titular character's need for conquest, and the destructive need for conquest Mary Shelley views as a masculine trait. Shelley challenges historical accounts which only include male perspectives and events, gender being a very important theme of her work. And it was actually feminist and psychoanalytic critics who reignited interest in her writing. The critic Anne K. Mellor states Frankenstein is about what happens when a man tries to have a baby without a woman. It is profoundly concerned with natural as opposed to unnatural modes of production and reproduction. Ella Moores sees the story as relating to Shelley's own loss of children, with the novel constituting a birth myth, also containing Mary's guilt for the death of her mother after she was born. In the seminal feminist text, The Mad Woman in the Attic, published in 1979, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar assert that in Frankenstein, Mary Shelley was responding to a male tradition of writing represented by Milton's Paradise Lost, which was published in 1667. They feel that Shelley affirms masculine traditions, but also conceals fantasies of equality that occasionally erupt into monstrous images of rage. Mary Poovey sees Frankenstein, and specifically its first edition, within Mary Shelley's writing more generally, which begins with literary self-assertion and ends with conventional femininity, according to Wikipedia. Shelley's fear of self-assertion is reflected in the fate of Frankenstein, who is punished for his egotism by losing all his domestic ties, and egotism was a trait which Mary saw in the men around her. Shelley celebrated the role of the family and the pivotal role of woman within the family structure, without which she believed society would collapse. So relegating women to the house and to domestic things was not a relegation. She felt that that role was essential in society. In Lodore, the patriarch of the family is killed pretty near the start of the story in a duel, and its two heroines then must navigate the financial, legal and social difficulties that this causes. According to Shelley scholar Betty T. Bennett, the novel proposes egalitarian educational paradigms for women and men, which could bring social justice as well as the spiritual and intellectual means by which to meet the challenges life invariably brings. As well as the focus on the role of women, Shelley also dissected the politicised literary romanticism that so featured in her social circle, especially in Frankenstein, where she rails against individualism and the egotism of the romantics of her day. So, unlike Prometheus or Satan in Paradise Lost, Victor Frankenstein's rebellion against the rules of nature is depicted as something dark and repellent. He abandons his family and creates something dangerous. And this was very much in response to Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, which is a long poem about the Greek mythological figure Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods, intending to create life, and was heavily punished for it. Of course, Shelley, being the radical that he was, extols Prometheus and extols his rebelliousness, whereas Mary Shelley says, no, that kind of individualism can lead to something bad. Bennett states that Mary Shelley believed in the Enlightenment idea that individuals could improve society through the exercise of political power, but feared that irresponsible exercise of power could create chaos. In essence, she criticises her parents' views. Mary Shelley did not share her father's optimistic view that humanity could eventually be perfected. The literary critic Carrie Locke writes of The Last Man, in its refusal to place humanity at the centre of the universe, its questioning of our privileged position in relation to nature, it constitutes a profound and prophetic challenge to Western humanism. Pamela Clement writes in her work, The Godwinian Novel, that in Frankenstein, Shelley offers a profoundly disenchanted commentary on the age of revolution, which ends in a total rejection of the progressive ideals of her own generation. Although she was disenchanted with revolution, Mary Shelley is definitely seen as a reformer and a reformist, especially in terms of the role of women. She also embraced liberal politics. For example, she was thrilled when the King of Spain was forced to grant the people a constitution in 1820. And she also wrote for Leigh Hunt's periodical The Liberal in 1823, and she was key to shaping its ideas. Although in the past there was a tendency to view Shelley as having become more conservative in Lodore and Faulkner, her later novels, some, such as Mary Poovey, challenge this, and Poovey claims that she transformed her reformist view to the domestic sphere rather than abandoning it. Anne K. Miller believes that Mary Shelley grounded her alternative political ideology on the metaphor of the peaceful, loving bourgeois family. She therefore implicitly endorsed a conservative vision of gradual evolutionary reform. Conversely, Bennett sees Shelley as having consistently supported romantic and reformist ideals. Jane Bloomberg claims Shelley was never a passionate radical like her husband, and her later lifestyle was not abruptly assumed, nor was it betrayed. She was, in fact, challenging the political and literary influences of her circle in her first work. Now let's talk about Frankenstein. And as ever, if you intend to read the novel and haven't done so yet, this does contain some spoilers, just so that you know. Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was published in 1818, and the novel tells the story of the scientist Victor Frankenstein, who creates a live, human-like creature whose existence is very unhappy, and he seeks revenge on his creator. Shelley began writing it when she was only 18, and she was 20 when it was published. Her name did not appear, though, until the second edition, which was published in Paris in 1821, and as we mentioned earlier, many presumed it had been written by Percy Shelley. On her European travels in 1815, Mary Shelley had stayed at Gernsheim, close to Frankenstein Castle, where an alchemist had carried out experiments 2 centuries earlier, so there was that kind of creepy atmosphere that she brings into the novel. Frankenstein has a well-defined place in literature, it's fair to say, as well as in popular culture, and it's inspired so many horror films and other kinds of movies and cartoons and spin-offs. I mean, Herman Munster, very much based on the Frankenstein story, sort of instantly recognisable when you see that something owes an homage to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Here's a little synopsis of the story. Frankenstein is written in epistolary form, which was obviously very popular at the time, beginning with an introduction by Captain Walton in a correspondence with his sister Margaret Walton Saville. Now, Robert Walton is a sea captain setting out on an expedition to the North Pole in search of scientific knowledge. His ship is trapped in ice in the Arctic Ocean, and the crew spots a dog sled driven by a huge man-like creature. When the ice breaks apart, they rescue Victor Frankenstein, who has been in pursuit of the creature. He sees a version of himself in Walton's scientific ambitions and so tells him his life story as a cautionary tale. He begins with his childhood and his family life, and from a young age he was obsessed with science and with alchemy. When Victor was 5, his parents adopted Elizabeth Lavenza, the orphaned daughter of Italian nobles, and he was to marry her once he came of age. His parents also take in Justine Moritz as a nanny for Victor's younger brother, William. Before he goes to university, Victor's mother dies and he buries himself in his experiments. Whilst he's at university, he excels at science, secretly developing a way to bring life to inert matter. He wants to create a human-like creature, but finds it difficult to create the smaller parts. And so he creates this 8-foot humanoid by stealing body parts from funeral homes and mortuaries and by using organs from wild animals. He selects beautiful parts for his creature, but the creature turns out hideous, with dull yellow eyes and with skin that doesn't really conceal what's underneath the skin. So when he animates this creature, Victor flees in terror from his own work. He then wanders the streets and meets his childhood friend, Henry Clerval. He is worried when he takes Henry back home, he'll see the creature, but when he comes home, the creature has fled from the laboratory. He's disappeared. So Victor falls ill. He's just really shocked by all this and is nursed by Clerval. He gives up science and takes up Oriental languages, which is Clerval's specialism. Victor then receives a letter from his father telling him that William has been murdered. Justine is convicted of the murder when a locket containing a portrait of Caroline, Victor's mother, that had belonged to William, is found in her pocket. But Victor knows the creature is to blame and that if he tells people this, he won't be believed. Filled with grief and guilt, he goes climbing in the Alps and there he encounters the creature, who insists that Victor listen to his story, and from this point the creature takes up the story. He describes his first days living alone in a wilderness. People were really afraid of him because of his appearance, and so he's forced to hide from them. He lives in a storage unit attached to a cottage, and he grows fond of the family that live in the cottage, who are quite poor, and he does things to help them without their knowledge. For example, gathering firewood, clearing the path of snow, and other little tasks like that. The son of the family is engaged to a Turkish woman and is having lessons in Turkish every night, which the creature listens to and so teaches himself to read and write. He also finds a lost satchel of books in the woods and uses those to teach himself reading. While he's in the woods, though, he sees his own reflection in a pool of water and realizes that his appearance is repulsive. He enters the cottage at last, intending to befriend the family when only the blind father is at home. So he and the blind father enter into a conversation, but when the rest of the family come home, they're terrified when they see the creature, and the son actually attacks the creature, who flees from the house. The family then leave the house out of fear that the creature will return. So feeling rejected by humanity, the creature vows revenge. Hating his creator for abandoning him, he travels to Geneva to find Victor, whom he believes is the only person with a responsibility to do anything to help him. On the way, he rescues a child who has fallen in a river, but the child's terrified father shoots him in the shoulder, and the creature once more swears revenge on mankind. In Switzerland, he meets William, who is at first completely frightened of him. The creature holds his wrist to calm him, but the boy screams his name and says he has powerful parents. So realizing that this is Victor's brother, the creature kills him to punish Victor. He takes William's locket and places it in Justine's pocket to frame her for the murder. The creature then demands a female companion of Victor at this point in the story, and he argues that as a living being, he's entitled to some happiness. He promises Victor that he and his mate will go to South America and stay there for good, and that Victor will never see them again. But he also threatens to kill Victor's friends and family if he doesn't cooperate, so Victor reluctantly agrees. The creature says he will be watching Victor's progress. The narrative then returns to Victor Frankenstein. Clerval travels with Victor to the UK, but they part in Scotland at Victor's insistence. And then Victor goes to Orkney, to the island, to make a female creature in secret, suspecting the creature is following him. He's fraught with premonitions of catastrophe, fearing that the female creature won't like the male creature or might be even more evil than him. He also fears the beginning of a new race that could threaten humanity, so he destroys his new creation, and the creature is incensed and demands that he resume his work. But Victor refuses, to which the creature leaves with the threat, "I will be with you on your wedding night." And Victor assumes that means that the creature is going to kill him while he's at his most happy. Victor sails out to sea to dispose of the equipment from the experiment and falls asleep in the boat. When he awakens, the wind has changed and he's been swept to Ireland, and he's arrested there for murder, although the magistrate views him with sympathy. An eyewitness attests that he was in Orkney when the murder was carried out. So Victor is shown the murder victim, and to his absolute horror, it is Clerval. So the creature has started to carry out his threat of killing Victor's friends and family. Victor basically has a mental breakdown, and his father comes to accompany him home. Elizabeth, by this stage, has received some of her father's fortune, and Victor's father has asked him to honour his mother's dying wish and marry Elizabeth. He fears that a curse has come on the family since there's been these two murders in the family circle. As Victor is about to marry Elizabeth, Victor arms himself with a dagger and pistols against the arrival of the creature, and on their wedding night he asks Elizabeth to stay in her room while he searches for the fiend, as he calls him. While he's out doing this, the creature strangles Elizabeth. Victor sees the creature at the window, pointing at Elizabeth's corpse in triumph. Victor shoots at him, but he escapes. Weakened by old age and by the grief of Elizabeth's loss, Victor's father dies only days later. Victor seeks revenge and pursues the creature across Europe and Russia. When he reaches the Arctic Ocean and heads towards the North Pole, he's actually within a mile of the creature but collapses with exhaustion, which enables the creature to escape. Eventually, the ice around Victor comes apart and he's rescued by Walton's crew, taking us back to the start point of the novel. Captain Walton concludes the story. A few days after they saw the creature, the ship is again trapped in ice and several crew members die. The rest of the crew insist they must turn southwards. Victor is angered and gives them a speech and reminds them that hardship and danger are part of a glorious endeavour such as their exploration. This does make an impression, but it doesn't change their minds. They still want to go home, and Walton agrees to turn homewards to avoid a mutiny. Victor, although he's ailing, vows to keep pursuing the creature, who he states must be killed. He's a danger to humanity. Victor himself dies a little while later, his last words to Walton being that he should look for happiness and tranquility and avoid ambition. Walton discovers the creature mourning his creator, and the creature tells Walton that his creator's death brings him no peace, but his evil actions have made him even more miserable than Victor Frankenstein could ever have been. He declares he will burn himself on a funeral pyre and no one will ever know that he existed. Walton watches the creature drift away on a raft of ice, never to be seen again.